Welcome everyone to our last day this week, our second week. So we have so many weeks ahead, and we have two sessions today, which I'm really excited about, which are water as data and infrastructure 1 and 2. So in a few hours we'll have another one, and this morning we have a really exciting panel to start with this kind of topic. I will be your chair today, so I'll just introduce each of the speakers before they speak, and then we'll keep the questions for the end. So make sure to note them down. You're welcome to start putting the questions in the chat if you'd like as well, but we'll discuss them toward the end. And as usual, if you're unable to open your camera or unmute yourself, it's perfectly fine to just use the chat for Q&A. I can read things out and we can bring them into the room as well. We are recording the presentations, but not the Q&A. So feel free to have your cameras off while the recording is going on if you'd prefer. And yeah, I think that's all of the main sharing duties bit. So I'll just introduce the speakers now in the order we have them. So we'll start with Alexandra's presentation. So Alexandra Coțofană is a research explores intersections of politics, modernities, and ontologies of governing. Alexandra's scholarly interests focus on political ecologies, the ontological turn, the study of political elites and ways of governing, as well as the occult as a tool for governing, and discursive techniques employed in populist imaginaries to form racial, gender, and political others. She also has 11 years of experience in organizing human rights documentary film festivals, and the last 4 of which were dedicated to being the director of the Inlights Film Festival in Bloomington, Indiana. Alexandra earned her PhD in cultural anthropology from Indiana University Bloomington, with a doctoral minor in religious studies. And prior to joining Zayed University, she had held a lectureship in history and anthropology at Butler University. If you'll join me in welcoming Alexandra with a little applause reaction, we're really excited to have her take over.
Thank you so much, Giulia. I think the description you read is a little bit old, but it does bring some context for what I'm doing now, which I'm going to get to anyway. Let me share my screen. All right, so thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Sam and Giulia, for organizing this. This is really, really exciting. So I'm going to talk to you today about this concept that I've come up with, which is atmospheric epistemologies. And so for those of you who maybe don't know so much about epistemology, that's the term just means like knowledge making practices. And so I'm looking at how people make knowledge about the atmosphere with a focus on cloud seeding. So I live and work in the UAE. I've been there for the last 6 years, and I'll tell you how I got to that project, to this project from projects that I was previously working on. These clouds are not from the UAE, they are from Nebraska, for anyone who cares about clouds, but I'm guessing maybe I'm the only one here. All right, so in 2019, I moved to Abu Dhabi, and at the time I was working on political elites and the occult, and conspiracy theories, and I was a scholar of Europe and the US, broadly speaking, focused on Romania, but it was becoming increasingly hard to do research elsewhere in the world. And then COVID hit also, and I was sort of trying to pivot to another project. And so the place where I was living at the time, you have these 5 towers. They're called the Etihad Towers, which apparently also they appeared in some Fast and Furious movie at some point. And 2 of them, I think, are residential. One is a hotel, one is something else, and one has like these conference rooms. And so I saw this banner that you see here for IREF, for the International Rain Enhancement Forum. And I told my husband, like, this is really weird. What even is that? And it just like stuck with me for a while, but like I didn't think about it too much. And then that summer or the summer after in 2021, I was at University of Edinburgh. I was a fellow there, writing about mountains and fascism and how those two connect. And my husband sent me this article from Breitbart that was focusing on the UAE and rainmaking. And for those of you who are lucky enough to not know what Breitbart is or QAnon, these are just these platforms that create conspiracies. They're very right-wing. And so I thought this would be a really good way to pivot all my knowledge about conspiracy theories. And I think the thing I had done before that hadn't worked very well was I was writing about conspiracy theorists. And my inner desire was to help conspiracy theorists, including my own father, who I had very often fights with. And so I realized that writing about conspiracy theorists is not going to help. So then I thought, if I'm in the UAE, I can use all of this knowledge I have, and I can interview scientists, and I can interview people who actually do cloud seeding. And then I can write things that the conspiracy theorists can read, and then they cannot say that, everyone's hiding information from them. I can say, this is actually what the scientists' life looks like, and this is what they do. And I knocked on their door and they answered. So if you want to knock on their door, I'm pretty sure they're going to answer also. So there's nothing like super occult about it. So this also helped me. It helped me in several ways. Part of what I do in my teaching, I talk a lot to students about decolonizing the discipline and about how important it is to be a native anthropologist. So I didn't want to be someone who just came to the UAE and started to study Emiratis, not speaking the language, not knowing anything about the culture. So I thought a good way of being a native anthropologist in the UAE would be to study other scientists, so other people of my tribe. So, that would sort of hold this moral line that I'm very passionate about. And then I had all this expertise in conspiracy theories, and I was like, okay, so this is something that I could do. And so this is what I've been doing for the last 4 years. And I got a grant from my university, and I've been to different places. I've done research in the US, in Sweden, in Norway. I've interviewed people, scientists from Israel, from South Africa, from Australia, just people from all over the world. And it was initially very hard to get scientists to talk to me, because turns out scientists don't like to be studied. And so even though I emailed a bunch of people, they never picked up. No one ever answered. So then I lured them all into a roundtable about the atmosphere. So I used this concept of atmospheric epistemologies, and I lured them all in a room. And that was the way I started to snowball. And some of the people who I met in February 2022 are some of my closest friends now. Then I got a 2-year grant, which then got extended to another year. So it's going to finish this year in September. I did a research trip in November and December of 2022 to Sweden and Norway, because that's where one of my first informants told me to go. I was 8 months pregnant, not a good idea. Then with a 4-month baby, I went to Colorado for the whole summer. And that is basically where everyone who matters in the cloud seeding world is. And that gave me a lot of social standing within the tribe when I came back to the UAE, and I could say, oh, I've met that person. Oh, I've talked to that person. And so that really built my standing within the community. And then in the fall of 2023, I interviewed a lot of people from the National Center of Meteorology. Then in spring and summer of 2024, I did some work on conspiracy theories. I also interviewed storm chasers, which is not here, but it should be. I actually did cloud seeding, because you have to, right? You have to do participant observation. And now I'm doing some writing, and for the rest of the summer, I'll try to do more cloud seeding. This is my son. So the reason why this slide is here is because I had to learn things about the atmosphere. So like most of us, I took classes in, physics and geography and chemistry and all that stuff in middle school, a little bit in high school, but my language of what the atmosphere wasn't very good. I didn't have the vocabulary, I didn't have the understanding. So much like a baby, I had to learn from scratch. So this is my baby learning what a cloud is. And here we had come back from Germany. I had given a keynote at University of Cologne, and we both got a cold, and this was a nebulizer. And so he was touching a cloud basically for the first time, and he was very excited about it. So we were learning about clouds together. So that was interesting, because much like him, I was discovering a lot of things for the first time. So I want to talk to you today a little bit about some of the atmospheric epistemologies I'm working with, right? So you have all of these groups of actors who are co-creating atmospheric epistemologies. Some of them agree with other groups, some of them disagree. Within certain groups, there is dissent. So for example, scientists don't always agree with each other. Some say cloud seeding should be done. Others say we shouldn't touch it. Then sort of above cloud seeding is a very local technique that you can do, but then above that you have geoengineering. And that's like where you can affect the atmosphere at a global level. And that's something that we don't yet have the intergovernmental treaties to do it, which is good because that would be not great for the planet. But cloud seeding is local. You just need, your own government to sign on it, and it's fine. So we have a bunch of audiences that look at cloud seeding and have opinions about cloud seeding. We have intermediaries that I'm going to talk to you about. So I'm writing 3 articles. One I've just finished. It's going to come out in Society and Space, I think. So it's about these 2 groups, publics and intermediaries, and how they work together. Then now I'm working on another article about scientists and politicians and how they work together. Then I have another piece on modelers and practitioners, and sort of how these 2 groups tango about the atmosphere, and how they change each other's way of thinking and so on. So we'll talk first about the publics. You have a lot of, in a country where you have cloud seeding, like the UAE, right? So the UAE has been doing cloud seeding for over 20 years now. So you have local spectators and international spectators. And those 2 groups of actors, they react very differently to cloud seeding. Some of them are affected very deeply by intermediaries. And here I mean journalists. I don't know how many people here know that in April of last year, the UAE had a very, very big storm. And on social media, there was this deluge of commentary that it's because of cloud seeding. Technically, you cannot create a storm of that size with cloud seeding. You could do it with geoengineering, but again, we don't have these intergovernmental treaties, so it's not possible. And then out of that idea that Emiratis used cloud seeding came a lot of Islamophobia. There was this, Abrahamic flood fantasy that all Emiratis should die, that there's only rich people living in the UAE, and that they deserve for their greed to all die. So this is what I analyzed, like 44,000 comments from social media that the algorithm was feeding me, and I had to analyze them by hand, because the social slurs that were being used would have never crossed my mind as keywords. So there are a few problems here. One is that these international spectators, they don't understand how cloud seeding works, right? Even if you have an elite in a country, you don't have a young man in a Porsche pushing a button to get cloud seeding. That's not how it works, right? You have scientific hierarchies, you have scientists, you have pilots, you have modelers, you have people in operations. You can't just cloud seed when you want and how you want. So that's one part of the issue, right? So science works exactly how it works in any other country, and you cannot over cloud seed. And then there's the technical part that people don't understand, which is that even if you did, let this greed go and let it be free, then you still wouldn't be able to cloud seed as much as to create a super cell green cloud. But part of what I want to say about this is this public has its own stereotypes about cloud seeding, about Gulf monarchies. But another problem came from very respectable international journalists who just decided to misrepresent what a scientist from the National Center of Meteorology had told them. So they got a call and they asked the National Center of Meteorology if they had sent airplanes out during the storm. And they were told that, yes, there were research planes being sent just to see the electricity, the level of electricity and other things about the storm, like what kind of a storm is it. And then they quoted them in an article saying that there was cloud seeding, and that article circulated and then other people picked up on it. I'm not going to tell you the names of the journalists so that I don't get sued, but I was very disappointed. And then after 48 hours, they retracted it, which, as you know, doesn't matter very much because in the first 48 hours, you get most of your clicks. So that fed, it was a cloud seeding of its own, if you want, where this sprinkling of news, of miscommunicated news, really fed the Islamophobia and everything else. Then you have commercial companies. These are very interesting because they're trying to sell cloud seeding to governments. And in a place like the US, where you need lobbying for cloud seeding and where funding dwindles, that makes sense. In the UAE, that doesn't make sense, and I'll tell you in a little bit why that is the case. All right, with scientists, we have scientists who are theoretical scientists who just think about physics and how it would work, and then you have the scientists who get involved in practice. This second category is who you would see at the International Rain Enhancement Forum trying to produce water, right? And these groups are very divided, as I told you. So some scientists, especially theoretical scientists, they claim you shouldn't even try to study cloud seeding, like why even mess with it? There are other scientists who don't do cloud seeding, but they say we should at least try to understand it, to just see if it has any potential, to see if it's efficient. And then there are the scientists who are very hands-on with it. So a group of scientists from Boulder, Colorado, where I did research, they did a multi-year experiment in Iowa that's called SNOWY. And right now, that's the biggest set of data we have about cloud seeding being efficient from whatever, it was winter clouds, and they were trying to cloud seed to make more snow, which then goes into the Colorado River in the spring and gives all of these different states, including California, water in the summer. So the scientists are not one group, right? They have their own opinions. Their politics affect how they do things. They're very interesting. The politicians are also very interesting, right? The biggest funding in history that has come to cloud seeding has been from the US government traditionally, but with this changing of regime every 4 years, as we know now, a lot of research funds are being just cut, straight up cut, including people who I interviewed. So people from NOAA and CAR, like all of these very big, very reputable state research institutions where they study everything about clouds, not just cloud seeding. And funding has been cut. It is, I think, a very bad idea because scientists will be the first ones to tell you we don't understand clouds, we don't understand how they work. If the government wants to put more money in the defense budget, for example, you have to understand what you're flying the planes through. So only for that very practical reasons, I think cutting funding on cloud research is a very bad idea. But I would also like to suggest something that has divided a room before, which is that democracy is not always the best for science. And hear me out, I only have the case of the US to make this very, very specific point with, which is that in the US, funding for cloud seeding has gone back and forth dramatically every 4 years. It really matters who's in power. Then by the time you get some funds, the regime has changed again, whatever. This is not what science needs. The UAE has this very exceptional case where someone from the royal family just cares about cloud seeding. They just found it interesting. And they made a promise to fund it for, I don't know for how long, endlessly. So you have this stream of funding that is just going to cloud seeding indefinitely. And because of the way this Gulf monarchy is set up, it's sort of a promise to the people from this fatherly figure that a water supply will be provided, right? So it's very interesting how it works. You wouldn't expect science to be fed by a space that's not democratic entirely. But this is how it works, and it's a very interesting case study. Democracy obviously is the best thing we've come up with politically until now, but in this particular situation, it's harming research very much, and research just needs decades of being told it's safe, and within that space, it can study the object of its study, which is clouds, which is very important, for as long as it needs. We then have the last two categories that I want to talk about very briefly are the practitioners and the modelers. So these two groups have atmospheric epistemologies that are at odds with each other. So the pilots and the people in operations, they understand clouds very well. They see clouds every day when they fly. While as the modelers, the people who are in an office and they look at the radar, they try to model cloud behavior. They have very room-bound knowledge, and they don't always understand how a cloud actually works. They understand computer models of clouds. Clouds are not very predictable. We know this because whenever we have, the Met Office or any meteorological office telling us the weather is going to be a certain way, there's a 50-50 chance that's not going to be true. So what happens is the pilots and the people in operations, although they're at the bottom of the hierarchy in cloud seeding, they just take orders of where they should cloud seed, how they should cloud seed. They often take decisions into their own hands because they're the people in the field. This gives them a freedom because they're not surveilled all the time, but it also makes operations much more efficient. But because there is this disconnect, research, published work about cloud seeding is not very good because it doesn't take into consideration the needs of pilots and people in operations, their knowledge, and so the data that's actually provided is not very good. So I'll give you just the simplest example. When someone sees a cloud on the radar, a radar updates itself every 6 minutes. By the time you're in the air, the cloud that you are told to cloud seed is not there anymore. So you just have to find a cloud to cloud seed, because clouds move very, very fast. They're very volatile, I guess, in so many ways. So then pilots decide where to cloud seed, which is elsewhere than when they were told to do it. So these are the 6 groups I'm working with and sort of the research that I'm doing. So I'm just going to stop here. And I guess whatever questions we have, we can talk about in a little bit. Thank you so much.
That was really amazing, Alexandra. Thank you, and so insightful. And I have so many thoughts and questions, but stop myself and keep them for the end of the panel when we've got to Q&A session at the end. Thank you so much. So we're gonna swiftly move to the next speaker, who is Lucie. Just gonna get your bio out so I can read it out as well. Lovely. So you see Česálková, hopefully I haven't destroyed it too much, is a film historian. She works at the Department of Film Studies at Charles University and as the editor-in-chief of the academic German Illuminasse, published by the National Film Archive. In her research, she focuses on the history of nonfiction cinema, specifically its educational, promotional, or instructional variants, on the history of non-commercial film exhibition and moviegoing. Lucie has been publishing articles in such journals as Film History, Memory Studies, The Moving Image, and Studies in Eastern European Cinema, and others, as well as many book chapters in the edited volumes. She recently co-edited a volume entitled Nonfiction Cinema in Post-War Europe, Visual Culture and the Reconstruction of Public Place, which you can find with AUP. It came out in 2024. Her current project focuses on the visual regimes of coal, water, oil, natural gas, and nuclear power, its surrounding narratives and imagery in state socialist Czechoslovakia. Engaging the environmental and energy humanities perspective, she analyzes the ways nature was framed and as a resource, specifically in Czech industrial and agricultural film. She's a member of the research group Environmental Humanities Prague, and together with Christian Ferenc Flat, she co-leads an international research group, Socialist and Post-Socialist Useful Film. So if you'll join me with a clap react to welcome Lucie, we're really excited about her presentation as well.
Thank you very much. And I think that the introduction basically well summarized the position I am coming from, which is the film studies, basically. So I will try to share my screen. Okay. So here we go. And for my today's talk, I prepared research, which actually is something that I do not do usually, because it will be centered around one person, a filmmaker, which helps me, however, to grasp three separate topics. First is science and film, what I call cinematic hydrology, because the filmmaker Olga Růžičková, she was the employee of the Water Research Institute in Czechoslovakia in the 1950s and in the 1960s. And she basically did films about water research. But through that and through this knowledge, she also developed her environmental, but I would also say ecofeminist position in the late 1970s. So this is basically what the talk is going to be about. So in the 1959, when the first female student of directing at the FAMU film school in Czechoslovakia completed her studies with the films Dead Rivers in 1956 and Smoke in 1959, she was labeled as by the committee as, I quote, unsuitable for artistic or popular science work, but at the most for research and technical films, unquote. This rejection by the head teacher, recognized feature film director, and other members of the committee not only affected the then 38-year-old Olga Růžičková deeply personally, but in retrospect we can say that it also significantly influenced her own further creative path and the position of her films in state socialist Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia at that time was a country under in the eastern bloc of the Cold War Europe, and the cinema was nationalized at that time. Růžičková and her work, most of which focused on the issue of pollution of rivers or air by industrial fumes, became an undercurrent, alive and predatory, undermining the banks, but almost invisible at first sight. This is why her work has remained and still remains aloof from critical and scholarly attention. Růžičková spent a significant part of her career working outside the nationalized state's film industry. She worked as a filmmaker at the Water Research Institute, and only in the mid-1970s did she get into the state-run enterprise Short Film, a body producing non-fiction film in the nationalized Czechoslovak cinema. Throughout her life, she made films almost exclusively about water, especially about dirty rivers, about the consequences of pollution and waste, and the possibilities of remedying the situation on the individual and collective level. At the time of their creation, these films were indeed described as research, technical or medical films, occasionally educational or documentary, and some of them made it into official distribution, also bringing home awards from specialized international film festivals. In the first half of the 1970s, at the time when Czechoslovakia was sinking into disillusionment and apathy as a result of the occupation by Warsaw Pact troops in the August 1968, at this wholly unlikely time, Olga Růžičková was instrumental in splitting the independent Eco-Film Festival from the original tech film, and worked to keep it alive as a key platform for environmental non-fiction filmmaking in the Eastern Bloc. She seems to have acted as a persistent side strand that is vital, but slow to break through to the surface, gradually growing stronger. Throughout her work, she repeatedly reflected on the relationship between humankind and water, specifically Czechoslovak rivers. Her position was highly critical to the modern use of the landscape as a resource, and at the time, at the same time an innocent repository of impurities, of the short-sightedness of the quick solutions of a consumer-based industrial society. Many of the images she shot were pure documentation of the destruction that waste in rivers or on ponds and lakes caused. Clear versus cloudy contrasted both on black and white film material in the 1950s and 60s and on color in the 70s and 80s. She filmed the bodies of water to literally mirror the indifference of consumer societies towards the environment. As such, Olga Ružičková's long-standing engagement with the issues of water and technical or documentary film, her life, thought, and work offer us an opportunity to re-examine the relationship between useful film or technical film, cinematic hydrology, blue humanities, eco-documentary studies, and feminism in the context of state socialism or the Eastern Bloc, which is exactly what this my talk today aims to do. So born in the 1921 and starting her filmmaking in the 50s, aged 35, Ružičková saw herself as a documentary filmmaker closely connected to science. This aspect of documentary filmmaking, the epistemic aspect, linked to scientific knowledge, was most important to her. All her films are most in line with this focus. These are documentaries based on scientific knowledge, trying to illustrate a specific issue, in her case, the interconnectedness of the relationship between society, industry, and nature, and to appeal to the audience in both a rational and emotional way. To engage both intellect and emotions was the significant intention standing at the beginning of all efforts to promote environmental ideas in Czechoslovakia. The environmentalism of her films is, however, often highly ambivalent, for they are films produced within the system whose fundaments they criticize. In the case of Ružičková, these films primarily criticize industrial society, regardless of the political regime that makes accelerated industrialization possible. But the poignancy of their testimony is always tempered by the techno-optimistic conviction that this society, as a society based on science, has solutions that can mitigate the effects of pollution. And these are, of course, the solutions promoted by the Water Research Institute, Ružičková's employer and sponsor of her films. As a filmmaker, Olga Ružičková moved between technical, popular science, and environmental documentaries. Her work can be divided into several groups, very substantially framed by their production context. With regard to the development of her creative path, it is significant that these groups also largely reflect certain phases of her career, influenced by the background of the institutions she worked for. The first group consists of student films made at FAMU, the famous Prague Film School. The second is Ružičková's work for the Water Research Institute, mainly dating back to the 1960s. In the 1970s, after several unsuccessful attempts, she moves into the short film, the official state-run enterprise, and the third phase of her work consists of films less tied to the Water Research Institute itself, but take stock of their previous experience in more complex films on issues of the relationship between water, nature, society, on agricultural and forestry issues. So in the second half of the 50s, Ružičková's student films open up quite rarely commented topics. Criticism of industrialization in a country with a strong industrial tradition was not at all one of the topics openly discussed at the time. In Dead Rivers, Ružičková took an explanatory approach by focusing on a specific region and its rivers, using film to demonstrate how the Bílina River is clean before it flows through the town Teplice, while further downstream beyond the city it is polluted. She also pointed out the biggest polluters, here specifically the paper mill in Dubí. The voiceover, the music, and shots in this film together underline the film's political appellativeness. The commentary spares no expressive language in naming the dirtiness of the river. And the weight of the accusatory shots of the damaged landscape, the murky river with protruding stumps of dying trees, is deepened by the dark music. Although the end of the film is aimed at warning cities and factories not to neglect their duty to clean up their wastewater, and thus shows that the solution to the situation is possible, given greater responsibility on the part of public actors, The dimension of that rivers is not only a critique of river pollution, but also an attempt to explain the complexity of life around rivers. Already in the first shots of the film, Růžičková explains that each river creates, I quote, its own world of animals and plants, unquote. Today we would use the term ecosystem, but that rivers, with its own vocabulary and way of depicting life around the rivers and underwater, clearly articulates the need for balance in nature and sees river pollution as a drastic disruption of it. Růžičková works in a similar way in Smoke, her second student film, about air pollution. Here the key instrument of her indictment of smoking chimneys in industrial areas are children, who play in ash instead of sand and eat a slice of bread with butter for their snack, which is not salted, but again sprinkled with ash. Růžičková's inspirations from time-lapse cinema traditions are clearly present in this film, both in the sped-up shots of the growth of flowers and in the sped-up shots of the effect of the acidified air on the gradually dying spruce tree. These methods, explaining briefly and clearly the problem and consequences of industrial air pollution on nature, were then complemented by alarming images of children in a dirty, ash-clogged sandbox. Although the film aimed to address the situation and offer the solution in the form of ash traps, at its core was an environmental and humanistic appeal. The films produced directly for the Water Research Institute. Olga Růžičková had to focus specifically on the projects that the institute was working on at the time. In the 1960s, its activities were primarily connected with the completion of large dam projects, primarily on the Vltava River. This led to films such as The Chronicle of the Slappy Dam in 1960 and others. These were primarily research and documentation films helping in the research tasks of the Water Research Institute. And what the institute basically did was building models of dams or other water systems and analyzing how water flows within them. For Růžičková, this meant filming models of future dam structures on which researchers of the Water Research Institute tested the water flow in various, even extreme situations, and modified the design based on these tests. The second line of the work of the Water Research Institute was the measurement of water composition, respective water purity, the control of drinking water reservoirs, and the promotion of wastewater treatment plants. In both types of films, water was shown as a subject of research, but in different contexts. One with regard to its composition and its possibilities of being truly life-giving for humans and surrounding organisms, and secondly, in terms of hydraulics, as a dynamic and energetic element whose flow and force can be measured, directed, and exploited. Olga Růžičková's research films thus offered, through water, on the one hand, a hydrogeological record, and on the other, a hydraulic vision that allowed for the cinematic study of the mechanical properties of water for research purposes. Hydrological or hydraulic vision offers a completely unconventional view of the water, different from shots of water surfaces or underwater worlds. It is interested in water itself, its composition, but also in the ways it moves in specific conditions. The directions of flow, the speed of the flow, the movements of the sandy bottom, the speed of the water gradient, the height of the waves, the movements of the water eddies, the degree of pollution. All of these water properties became concrete quantities in the research of the Water Research Institute and depicted phenomena in Olga Růžičková's films. Breaking away from the Water Research Institute at the beginning of the 1970s did not mean abandoning the subject of water for Růžičková, but a certain synthesis of her existing knowledge. She made a number of films for short film and for the International Association on Water Pollution Research that reflected more concisely on the importance of water in the ecosystems, such as All People Matter in 1974 or For the Life of the Blue Planet in 1976. A certain culmination of Růžičková's efforts is this commissioned film For the Life of the Blue Planet. Produced in the mid-1970s, this film can be easily described as an eco-critical documentary in which Růžičková summarized her previous thoughts on how to present natural phenomena in their complementarity, as interrelated and mutually necessary. In her notes on the theme, Růžičková explicitly referred to nature as community to emphasize that the threat to one organism can have consequences for the others, as it upsets the balance of the community. Although the notion of balance in nature is widely discussed and reconsidered in both biology and ecology, for Růžičková, it served primarily to break the nature-culture divide and to express the idea of the interdependence of various forms of life, including phenomena such as pollution, which remained Růžičková's primary focus, clearly identified as caused by humans, their excessive industrial production and consumerism. For the Life of the Blue Planet attempts to visually grasp the interconnectedness of everything that happens in nature, including the interrelationship of natural and industrial phenomena through framing and general work with filmic space. The point of view of the camera in this film is not at the traditional eye level of the human cameraman, but lower, closer to the water surface and the plants surrounding it. At the same time, the film's commentary describes aquatic organisms and vegetation around water bodies as complementary, emphasizing that, I quote, individual species make possible through their life the life of other species, unquote. The film looks at the individual phenomena in and around the rivers in detail, and the camera movement suggests a relationship to the larger whole. Similarly, the lyrical shots of the rivers in the sun's haze both focus on the body of water itself and attempt to show its surroundings by reframing it, suggesting the spatial connection between bodies of water and the sources of pollution, and explicitly showing the consequences. To the theme of water pollution, which Růžičková always treated locally in her work, always in relation to a specific river in Czechoslovakia, here, on the contrary, she takes a more general, global view. In addition to rivers, she points to the seas and oceans and presents a wider range of reasons and consequences of pollution. The idea of nature as community, through which Růžičková interconnected the life of natural organisms, people, and their industrial and agricultural activities, resonated with the idea of environmental connectivity represented in her other films. All People Matter points out the many little human mischiefs against nature. The commentary teeters on the edge of irony and apocalypse, presenting clean rivers as an illusion known only from ancient fairy tales, while polluted civilization, I quote, will gradually consume our surroundings and our homes, unquote. In this and other several films, she also explicitly names the convenience and ignorance of consumer society as a part of the problem. In All People Matter, she refers to consumer modernity as an era in which people do not want to limit themselves in their desires and sees this type of freedom as conquering, stating that human who does not limit himself or herself also sees himself or herself as a master of nature, who is allowed everything, finds ways difficult, and gets rid of it in the quickest way, thinking that water can carry everything. In her remarks, Růžičková also understood the thoughtless littering as a disturbance of the community, because, according to her, there is no us and them in nature. Dressed in rubber boots, shorts, and bra, filming tree stumps melting in polluted waters, Růžičková wanted to use the film to show and prove what was being lost in the official discourse, specifically how destructive the industrial exploitation of river is. She was interested in water as a source of life on Earth, and as such, therefore, the clearest example of how short-sighted the recklessness of pollution is. As we have seen in various examples in this paper, Růžičková's personal notes do not form coherent texts, but consist of short fragments of thoughts closely linked to her film work. One of the recurring themes in them is the question of the different temporalities of damage and the subsequent care for reparation. I quote, "Evil is done quickly, but one must take time to do good. Good is done slowly, like planting a flower, watering it and tending it to make it grow." Unquote. For Růžičková, care was again closely linked to the natural element, but also to femininity. In one of the very rare interviews she gave to the media, Růžičková answered the question of why she is devoted to environmental issues. I quote, "I choose ecology perhaps because as a woman I was very close to the aesthetics of the landscape. Even in nature, you have to keep things tidy and clean," unquote. Her idea that caring for the nature as community was a women's business was intertwined with the conservative idea of cleanliness and tidiness as a positive aesthetic quality, a virtue belonging to women. Through these fragments of reflection, Olga Růžičková and her work can be perceived in the broader context of the ecofeminist consciousness of the late 1970s and early 80s, even though she was in no way connected to the thinkers of this type, nor their writing. As Astrida Neymanis discusses in detail, a number of approaches to the question of the connection between nature and femininity have developed in ecofeminist thought. One of the key beliefs very close to Růžičková's position, Neymanis connects with early ecofeminism that accepted the connection between women and nature as positive, as in their view a truly natural value that should be further developed. Although this model of ecological destiny as maternal, order-loving and therefore feminine and vice versa, can be seen as exacerbating problems of inequality and binary worldviews, and has been described by some writers as a neoconservative or depoliticized, for a generation older Růžičková, her filmmaking was a very specific political struggle. A struggle that she waged from her admittedly female position, which she perceived as marginal, but which nevertheless enabled her to persistently, albeit slowly, strive to advance her goals even in a state socialist system. Her view was not devoid of political gesture, but it was not anti-systemic. She was trying to bring about change in the given conditions. In a similar way, she thought about her relationship to the environment from the perspective of a female filmmaker. It cannot be argued that she was coming from a radical feminist position. It is even possible that she was not familiar with such considerations, that her life and films fulfilled ecofeminist principles. Her work is proof that a vital source of environmental thinking can spring from the technical, didactic, and perhaps even over-poetic films that repeat themselves. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Lucie. That was so interesting. I've learned so much. So we're going to move on to the last, but definitely not least presentation, and then we'll have a nice amount of time for discussion, which is quite exciting. So let me just, where did I move your bio? I had it already, and then I moved. There we go. So our last presentation today is by Mikko Toivanen, who's a research fellow at the Friedrich-Meinecke Institute, Freie Universität Berlin, where his work is funded by the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters. He specializes in global and colonial history with a focus on British and Dutch colonies in 19th-century Southeast Asia. His current research project investigates the development of colonial urban culture and different notions of public space in Singapore and Batavia, which is now the current Jakarta, in the latter half of the 19th century. While his further research interests include the history of Nordic colonial entanglements, the global history of forestry research and practices, and the transnational circulation of imperial knowledge. Mikko defended his PhD on colonial travel and tourism in Southeast Asia at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy in 2019, and most recently is the co-editor of the volume Integration and Collaborative Imperialism in Modern Europe at the Margin of Empire, 1800-1950 with Bloomsbury 2024. So if you'll join me in virtually clapping to welcome Mikko, we're really excited about this presentation as well.
Thank you very much, Giulia, for that introduction. Yeah, and it's great to be here. Thank you for having me here. So like you said, I'll be talking today, giving you a talk titled Managing the Flow of a Colonial City, Water Infrastructure as a Technology of Control and a Site of Negotiation in 19th Century Batavia. And just before I start, I do want to say that this research, I have actually already published this research in an article that you can find in the latest issue of the Historical Journal, more or less the same title. And I also just want to say that this is an open access article, so if you're interested in the topic or if the talk gets you interested, then just Google the article and it's free to read. So by all means. So this is my research, but of course I'm also building on the research of others, and I just want to mention a couple of names here before we start who have worked on water in Batavia for much longer than I have, done great work. And so I want to mention Prativi Putri. And there's one citation there that you can follow up if you want, and then also Michelle Coy and Karen Bakker. And Karen Bakker recently passed away, but has done a lot of work in this field. So very, very important work that I'm building on. Also, just before I go any further, I just want to make sure that everyone knows where we are in the world. So Batavia, like Giulia said, is now Jakarta. The capital of Indonesia was, in the 19th century, the capital of the Dutch East Indies. And you can see it there on the map in Southeast Asia on the island of Java. I won't go to the longer history too much, but sorry, Sam put the link to the article in the chat. I just want to see that no one was writing like you can't hear me or something. Okay. I won't go to the longer history of Jakarta here, but just to say that before the Dutch arrived in Java in the 17th century, there was also a settlement in this area called variously Sunda Kelapa or later Jayakarta. And when the Dutch arrived in the early 17th century, they basically razed this settlement to the ground and built their own European city on top of it. So Batavia is the European city that we'll be talking about today, but it also has this longer history. Right. So I'm going to just start with a couple of quotes to get us into the themes of today's talk. And these quotes are from a Batavia newspaper, the Java Bode. And I have just realized that I can't actually read the quote because I have the camera right. I have to move that. So these are from 1884, and these are both from the same issue of this newspaper, and in fact from the same page 6 of this newspaper. So I just mentioned that to sort of show how these different issues of water use or abuse, as it may be, get entangled in the colonial discourse. So the first quote has to do with canals, and it goes like this: "A great danger for health, to which we very seriously call the attention of our administration and our enthusiastic police, and also of the Health Commission, in case that body still remains alive, is the natives," colonial language here, "a hobby of setting up little dams in the small streams and canals in order to trap and catch the few miserable fish that swim there." So this is about the right and wrong uses of water and who gets to decide it. The same is true also of the second quote, which has to do with a different water technology. So this quote on the same page of the newspaper goes like this: "Some inhabitants of Kuitang, which is a neighborhood in Batavia, complain over the unbearable stink spread everywhere by the unseemly ditch running from the hydrant behind the missionary church to behind the house of Mr. Mars. The ditch is half full since, despite all prohibitions, some of the natives living in the vicinity make an all too greedy use of the artesian drinking water for bathing, blocking the flow of water and causing it to lay stagnant. Can the police do nothing about this?" So this is a reader's letter complaining about this perceived abuse of water. And I just wanted to use these two quotes firstly to highlight these two technologies, the canals and the hydrants, but also to draw your attention to a few themes. So one theme, like I already mentioned, is this question of what are the right and the wrong uses of water technology and who gets to decide that. Secondly, in the colonial context, the question of authority and policing. Both of these authors of these letters or editorials appeal to the authorities to sort of regulate and control the use of water, especially by the local communities. And then thirdly, the question of race. And as you can see from both of these quotes, the perceived misuse of water is highly racialized, and it's associated with what are supposed to be sort of the less educated or less civilized manners of specific communities. Now, the native community here in the colonial language native, what it actually means is it can mean a lot of things. It can mean Sundanese or Javanese, Ambonese, Malay in different ways. So this is unclear because of the language of the day, which just sort of blurs all of these different communities into this one block. I just want to say that. So I'll start with, so in the talk, I will go over 3 technologies, and I'll just start with the canals that we've already mentioned. So the Dutch, of course, well known for canals in the Netherlands, also brought this technology to Batavia, or when they built Batavia. And you can see here a map of just the old town center of Batavia from the end of the 18th century, and these blue lines that you can see quite prominently all around the city, they are canals. So there had been these canals there for centuries by the 19th century, and the problem is that they didn't really work very well. There was rarely enough water in the canals, and the flow rate of the canals was too slow, so which led to these problems of stagnant water, but also kind of filth and waste not being pushed away from the city, which partly relates to what the first quote was complaining about. So this is really an infrastructural issue. The problem with the infrastructure has to do with soil erosion in the uplands around Batavia, especially with sort of intense rice cultivation, which means that the canals silted up very quickly and got blocked and had to be drained and opened all the time. Nevertheless, in the colonial public discourse, this infrastructural failure was frequently framed as a kind of a moral failing, especially on the part of the Asian communities in the city. So here we have another quote from 1840, a bit earlier, having to do with the water in the canals, and it goes like this. No wonder, therefore, that the water takes on a brownish and filthy appearance, which by sight alone makes a distasteful effect, which is then unpleasantly stirred by various circumstances. When we, for example, see in that same water that we subsequently drink a number of natives and Chinese, many among them afflicted with skin and other diseases, bathing and washing, and carrion and other filth floating by. Now, this is unpleasant language, and this is also racist language. But I do want to wanted to pick this quote to highlight what it tells about why water was seen as such a problem by the colonial authorities and the European elites in the city. And it's this idea that it acts as a kind of a mediator of bodily contact. Using the same water, perhaps even drinking the same water, at least on the level of imagination, brings the colonizer into physical contact with the Asian communities in the city, which then also serves to sort of underline the limits of colonial control and the limits of the colonial apparatus to separate different communities and Europeans and Asians from each other. So this creates this sort of prevailing anxiety about water and about its uses. There are a lot of photographs of the canals of Batavia, especially from, of course, the late 19th century. Photographs like this. I find these a really interesting source. They often depict people, often women, either bathing or bathing their children, or also doing washing. Often doing washing, not just for themselves, but also for the white households where they might have been working as servants. But also what you can see in these photos, perhaps against the intentions of the photographers themselves, is what I would argue a kind of an alternative public sphere of the city. So like I said, the Europeans wanted to avoid the canal water, and the canals in particular, as this sort of site of filth and also labor. But this also meant that these sorts of canal-side spaces, as you can see here with these steps and these sorts of platforms, kind of naturally became places of congregation, of gathering for lower class people in the city, not just for work, but also for just kind of general chatting and sort of socializing. So what I would argue is that water infrastructure provided this kind of alternative public space in the city that was Europeans were not excluded from, but basically excluded themselves from. So therefore, giving this sort of more a different view of public life in the city. So the canals often didn't work as they were intended, so other solutions were needed. The second technology that the Dutch tried to introduce in the 19th century is that of filtration. And you can see here in this photo, it's just a photo of some documentation from the Ministry of Colonies, who ran studies in the late 1830s on different available filtration technologies and how they could be introduced in Batavia. This particular diagram that you can see here is detailing a technology that was in use in Paris at the time and was being tested as a possible introduction to Batavia. And then in 1840, the Ministry of Colonies commissioned a Dutchman from Leiden called Arend de Bruin. So the Brown, which I find to be a very ironic name for a person filtrating water, purifying water, who came to Batavia to introduce his own patented filtration systems in the city. It's very difficult to know how widely these systems were actually deployed. As far as I've been able to see, they were primarily used in the harbor to provide drinking water for shipping needs. But it's also quite possible that they were also introduced in some major buildings, hotels and public buildings in the city as well. But because of how sort of fundamentally small scale these technologies are, as you can see also in this diagram, it's basically just tens or perhaps hundreds of liters of water that run through the system at a time. You couldn't really deploy this at the scale of the whole city, so it was always only just a very partial solution, which meant that something else had to be figured out. And in the 1870s, the Dutch start this big project of supplying the city with hydrants and artesian wells. So artesian wells, for those who don't necessarily know the term, just means these kinds of deep bore wells. So you have to drill very deep into the ground to get into the pure groundwater that is good to drink. And then so you draw the water from these walls, and then you make systems of plumbing that lead the water into hydrants that are just water collection points around the city. In this map, which is from 1879, you can see the wells that had been drilled by that time, and there are only 6 in the first decade of this project. So this is quite slow labor because of how resource intensive it is. I also just want to say that you can see in the map these wells are concentrated very much in the south of the city, which is the new town of Weltevreden, where the kind of the Dutch elites, especially the Dutch and the European elites of the city lived. So no surprise that the infrastructure was also centered around there. The hydrants themselves often look like this, especially in the sort of more fancy neighborhoods of the city. And this is from the Wilhelmina Park, a kind of a leisure spot for the elites. And you can see that this provision of this service is very much tied into a kind of elite culture, not just because of who it was for, but also for where these hydrants were. So this is the kind of park where people would go on sort of evening drives and evening walks and socialize casually, and then also kind of get the water for drinking or for their children or whatever needs they might have. So it is at this point in time quite a limited service and for quite a limited community in the city. Nevertheless, it was inaugurated with quite a lot of talk about how it was a kind of a work of charity from the colonial administration. And so this quote is from a speech in 1876 when the first hydrants were inaugurated. And this is a city official who talks about these hydrants with quite a lot of fanfare. He says, "You surely share with me the conviction that the great master," this just refers to the European, from the Malay Tuan Besar, the kind of the big boss. Anyway, "the great master watches over your welfare without rest. No cost is spared to secure those who before had to drink the red kali, so stream water, and the free use of good water, giving health to the little man and the whole population." So there is this language of kind of paternalism employed here, of a kind of a well-meaning state authority supplying this thing to the needs of the little man, to the benefit of whole society. Even though, as I have just mentioned, In fact, the services was very limited, especially in these early decades of its introduction. And in fact, because of how limited the capacity of these wells was, quite strict limits had to be imposed on how the water could be used. Calculations were made on how much a single household could be allowed to use water on a daily basis. And this could vary widely from the kind of the wealthiest European households, which were thought to need maybe 180 liters per day, because they would use it for bathing several times a day. And then the kind of poorest working class local communities, especially if they were living somewhere close to a river, who were thought to be who it was thought would only need around 15 liters, so less than 10% of what the kind of the elite European need was considered to be. So there was kind of these harsh hierarchies of use for what was supposed to be a charitable service provision. Of course, in practice, these limits and these regulations proved to be very hard to actually police. The people, once the hydrants were there in public spaces, the people of the city turned out to quite like using them and using them for all sorts of uses that the administrators had not necessarily planned them for. And especially this means bathing in public spaces, but also doing your washing, your clothes, your laundry. And there's a lot of complaints about this in the newspapers, Europeans writing that local washerwomen are making use of clean water when they should be going to the rivers and so on. I wanted to pick out this particular quote because it's quite interesting, where the author of the letter complains, a Dutch man, complains that he's run across a group of women doing washing around one of these hydrants. And he kind of admonishes them and tells them to go away, but the women respond, saying, among other things, this thing, why not? So why shouldn't we use this water? So we are not wasting the water. We pay the quartermaster our yearly taxes, and therefore we must have free use of the water. So what you can see here is a kind of a claim to a right. So this kind of flips the script a little bit in the colonial cities. So from this idea of paternalism and sort of charitable provision, this suddenly moves into a language of public goods and rights, and also public goods as a duty of the government to provide for its citizens in exchange for taxes. I don't want to make this into a kind of a too strong an argument about citizenship or anything like this, but you can see here a kind of a incipient movement towards making demands to the colonial administration in exchange for your own contribution to society. So this development, of course, moves much further in the 20th century when we get to actual anti-colonial resistance and the independence movement. But you can see here some signs of that. It is also not just an isolated incident. You see other stories in the newspapers, especially of the Chinese and Arab communities, making similar claims or making demands, sort of sending official delegations to request hydrants to be built in their neighborhoods and the provision to be improved in their neighborhoods. So this is bappening on a broader base as well. So now I'm running out of time. I'll just come to my conclusions very quickly. So I guess the main point here is that technology, all of these different technologies, they can never be a solution when the fundamental problem is something like racialized notions of who has more rights than others, whose habits, whose uses are more valuable than those of others. In this particular city, in the colonial context of Batavia, what was the main problem was actually the infrastructural inadequacy of the water infrastructures, but this was frequently framed as these kinds of racialized social problems as a way to defend the authority of the colonial state and to sort of hide the limits of their authority. But on the other hand, I also want to make this argument that specifically or precisely the kind of the routine everyday nature of different water uses made these points of infrastructure very natural springboards for a kind of a different conception of the urban public. So they became these sorts of gathering spots where people would gather with their children, with their work, with their sort of laundry or washing, and also to bathe, and that just sort of create a sense of community in a public space that Europeans were not involved in. And then once this infrastructure was publicly deployed, it proved to be extremely difficult for the authorities to actually restrict uses in any meaningful sense. You couldn't really put limits on how much water you get out of a hydrant. The technology wasn't there. And in particular, it became very difficult to justify differential entitlement, who gets to bathe in clean water and who doesn't. These questions became very tricky very quickly. Those are my conclusions. I'll just very quickly put these here, the credits for the images that I've been using, which are all public domain. And otherwise, I'll just say thank you and look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Mikko. That was so interesting. And thank you to all speakers for an amazing panel.